40 experts failed before lunch. The 41st person was not even supposed to be in the room. The ballroom of the Sterling Grand Hotel overlooked the waters of Boston Harbor like a glass palace built for people who never expected to hear the word impossible. Sunlight poured through the towering windows. Crystal chandeliers scattered reflections across polished marble floors. Rows of executives, scholars, investors, and journalists filled every seat. At the center of it all stood Nathan Sterling, a 48-year-old billionaire known for solving problems most people considered unsolvable. He built companies. He bought struggling businesses and transformed them into success stories. He trusted data, logic, and expertise. That morning, he had invited 40 of the most respected Arabic language experts in the country to participate in a challenge that had captured attention far beyond academic circles. On the giant screen behind him appeared a short phrase written in an obscure form of Arabic script. The reward for solving it correctly was $1 million. A murmur moved through the audience. Some smiled confidently. Others stared at the phrase with narrowed eyes. Cameras flashed. Reporters adjusted their microphones. Nathan remained calm. He folded his hands and looked across the room. One phrase, he said. One correct interpretation. That is all. The challenge had already become famous online during the previous week. Linguists debated it. Historians argued over it. Universities discussed it. Yet no one had reached a definitive answer. Today, Nathan intended to settle the question once and for all. Near the back of the ballroom, Claire Bennett carried a tray of coffee cups between tables. At 29 years old, she blended easily into the background. Her brown hair was tied neatly behind her head. A simple black apron covered her uniform. Guests rarely looked at her for more than a second. That was normal. She preferred it that way. While wealthy attendees discussed million-dollar investments, Claire quietly refilled water glasses and cleared empty plates. She moved through the room almost invisibly. The phrase on the screen meant nothing to most people in the audience. To Claire, it sparked the faintest feeling of recognition. Not understanding. Recognition. Like hearing a melody she had not heard in years. She glanced at it briefly before continuing her work. On stage, the first expert stepped forward. He adjusted his glasses and delivered a detailed explanation. The audience listened carefully. Nathan thanked him. Then another expert offered a completely different interpretation. Then another. By mid-morning, confidence began to crack. The answers disagreed. Arguments emerged. Scholars challenged one another politely but firmly. Some focused on grammar. Others focused on historical context. None of them could explain every element of the phrase. Nathan listened without revealing his thoughts. He had heard dozens of explanations over the past year. None satisfied him. That was why this event existed. Across the ballroom, Claire placed fresh coffee near a table of investors. As she turned away, one of the experts raised his voice while defending a translation. Several audience members nodded. Claire paused for only a second. Something about the explanation felt wrong. She could not explain why. Not yet. But the uneasy feeling remained. She looked toward the giant screen once more. The phrase seemed strangely familiar. And before the day was over, that feeling would change everything. By noon, the confidence that had filled the ballroom was beginning to fade. The giant screen still displayed the same mysterious phrase. The words had not changed. Yet the atmosphere around them had transformed completely. 40 Arabic experts sat beneath the bright lights of the conference hall, but certainty was becoming increasingly difficult to find. One after another, respected scholars stepped forward to defend their interpretations. Some argued that the phrase came from a medieval manuscript. Others insisted it belonged to a regional dialect that had disappeared centuries ago. A few claimed it was a poetic construction with multiple meanings. Their credentials were extraordinary. Their reputations were unquestioned. Yet every explanation seemed to leave something unresolved. Nathan Sterling remained seated near the stage, listening carefully. His expression revealed almost nothing. That alone made many people nervous. Most of the experts had expected a straightforward academic challenge. Instead, they found themselves trapped inside a puzzle that refused to cooperate. Several journalists sitting near the front rows exchanged whispers. Camera operators adjusted their equipment. Social media updates were already spreading across the country. What had begun as a prestigious intellectual event was slowly becoming something much larger. Near the back of the ballroom, Claire Bennett moved quietly between tables carrying fresh coffee and bottled water. She listened without appearing to listen. Years of working in hotels had taught her how to become invisible. Wealthy guests often spoke freely around people they barely noticed. Claire understood that better than anyone. As another expert presented his theory, she glanced toward the screen. The uneasy feeling returned. Stronger this time. The phrase continued pulling at a distant memory she could not quite reach. It felt like trying to remember a dream moments after waking up. The shape remained. The details disappeared. At one point, an audience member stood and applauded an especially confident presentation. Several others joined in. The expert smiled proudly. Nathan thanked him politely. Then Nathan asked a single question. The expert hesitated. The applause ended almost immediately. A few seconds later, the scholar admitted that part of the phrase still could not be explained. A quiet wave of disappointment moved through the room. Nathan nodded respectfully and invited the next participant forward. The pattern continued throughout the afternoon. Every answer sounded impressive. Every answer contained gaps. Meanwhile, Claire carried an empty tray toward the service entrance. Before stepping through the door, she looked back at the screen once more. Her eyes lingered on a specific word near the center of the phrase. Something about it felt wrong. Not the spelling, not the grammar, the assumption. Everyone seemed to be treating the word as though it belonged to a single language tradition. Claire suddenly wondered whether that assumption itself was the mistake. The thought arrived unexpectedly and vanished just as quickly. She frowned slightly. Inside the service corridor, other employees discussed the event with curiosity. Most were amused that 40 experts appeared unable to agree on anything. Claire said nothing. She poured coffee into a fresh pot and returned to work. Yet throughout the rest of the afternoon, the phrase followed her. Every conversation, every tray, every step across the ballroom. By the time the final expert finished speaking, Nathan had received 40 different answers and no solution. The audience sensed it. The experts sensed it. Nathan sensed it. As people prepared for a short break before the evening session, Claire looked at the screen one more time. Then, for the first time all day, a single forgotten memory began to surface from somewhere deep in her past. Most people believed the challenge was about language. Nathan Sterling knew it was really about memory. As the audience returned from the afternoon break, the atmosphere inside the ballroom felt different. The excitement remained, but uncertainty had replaced confidence. 40 experts had spoken. 40 experts had failed to produce an answer that satisfied every part of the puzzle. The giant screen still displayed the phrase. Silent. Unchanged. Waiting. Nathan stood near the stage while technicians prepared for the evening session. Several reporters approached him hoping for clues. He offered none. He had spent years guarding the true reason behind the challenge. Most people assumed it was an intellectual exercise designed to attract attention. Others believed it was a publicity event connected to one of his companies. Neither explanation was correct. The truth was far more personal. On the front row sat Sophie Sterling, Nathan's 14-year-old daughter. She had arrived shortly before the break ended. Unlike the investors and academics filling the room, Sophie looked at the screen without pretending to understand it. She simply watched her father. She knew him better than anyone. She recognized the tension hidden behind his calm expression. She also knew this challenge mattered to him in a way he rarely discussed. Across the ballroom, Claire Bennett quietly collected empty coffee cups while listening to conversations around her. Everyone seemed fascinated by the mystery. The experts debated among themselves. Journalists exchanged theories. Guests speculated about what would happen if nobody found the answer. Claire remained silent. Yet the memory that had surfaced earlier refused to disappear. It grew clearer with every passing minute. Years ago, before financial problems forced her to leave college, Claire had studied comparative linguistics. Languages fascinated her. Not because of grammar. Because of history. Languages carried stories. Migrations. Trade routes. Families. Entire civilizations hidden inside words. During one semester, she became especially interested in Middle Eastern language evolution. She spent countless nights in the university library studying rare texts and linguistic hybrids created when cultures intersected. Most students considered the subject impossibly difficult. Claire loved it. Then life changed. Tuition became impossible. Her father became ill. Dreams were postponed. Bills came first. The books disappeared. The knowledge remained. Standing beside a service station near the back wall, Claire looked toward the screen once more. This time she noticed something she had overlooked before. Not a word. A pattern. Her pulse quickened slightly. The phrase contained a structure that felt unusual. Certain elements appeared Arabic. Others did not. It was subtle enough that most people would never notice. Yet once the possibility entered her mind, it refused to leave. On stage, Nathan addressed the audience again. His voice echoed softly through the ballroom. "Before we continue," he said, "there is something you should know." The room immediately fell silent. Nathan looked toward the phrase displayed behind him. For a moment, he seemed less like a billionaire and more like a father carrying an old memory. This challenge began 12 years ago. The audience listened carefully. The phrase was discovered among documents that belonged to my late wife. A wave of surprise moved through the room. Nathan rarely spoke publicly about her. Sophie lowered her eyes. Nathan continued. Every expert I consulted offered a different explanation. None could fully explain it. I promised myself I would keep searching until someone could. Silence followed. Heavy. Genuine. Across the ballroom, Claire felt something shift inside her. The challenge was no longer abstract. It belonged to a real person, a real family. And for the first time all day, she began to suspect she might know where the experts had gone wrong. The evening session resumed beneath a sky slowly turning gold beyond the glass walls of the ballroom. The harbor reflected the last light of day while hundreds of eyes returned to the stage. Nathan Sterling stood quietly beside the screen. The revelation about his late wife had changed the mood completely. What had once felt like a prestigious competition now felt personal. The audience no longer wanted a winner. They wanted an answer. One by one, several of the experts returned to the microphone. The story Nathan had shared seemed to energize them. They reviewed their earlier conclusions. They adjusted theories. They challenged assumptions. Yet the deeper they searched, the more confused the phrase appeared to become. One professor argued that the text represented a forgotten regional expression. Another insisted it originated from a rare literary tradition. A third claimed the phrase had been copied incorrectly generations ago. Each explanation sounded intelligent. Each explanation impressed the audience. And each explanation left something unexplained. Nathan listened respectfully. Sophie sat quietly in the front row. Occasionally, she glanced at her father. The years had taught her to recognize disappointment even when he tried to hide it. Across the ballroom, Claire Bennett carried a tray between tables while her thoughts moved faster than her feet. The pattern she had noticed earlier continued bothering her. Every expert approached the phrase from the same direction. Every expert assumed the foundation was purely Arabic. Claire was beginning to suspect that assumption was preventing them from seeing what stood directly in front of them. She stopped briefly beside a service station and looked toward the screen again. The phrase contained several elements that appeared ordinary when examined separately. Together, however, they felt unusual. Her college professors used to describe language as a map of human movement. People traveled. Cultures met. Words migrated. Meanings changed. Sometimes the answer to a puzzle was not hidden inside a language. Sometimes it existed between languages. A memory suddenly became clearer. Years ago, during a graduate seminar she attended before leaving school, one professor had discussed linguistic crossroads in the Middle East. Certain communities blended vocabulary from multiple traditions over centuries. Outsiders often misidentified the origin because they focused on appearance rather than history. Claire felt a small chill run through her. Could that be what was happening here? She immediately doubted herself. These were world-class experts. She was a waitress carrying coffee cups. The idea seemed ridiculous. Yet the doubt failed to erase the possibility. On stage, another respected scholar completed a lengthy presentation. Applause followed. Nathan thanked him politely. Then he asked a simple question. How do you explain the third word? The scholar paused. A few uncomfortable seconds passed. Finally, he admitted he could not. The applause faded. Silence returned. Nathan nodded and moved on. The pattern repeated itself again and again. Brilliant explanations collapsed under a single missing detail. The audience began noticing it too. Frustration quietly spread through the room. Claire watched from the back. The more she listened, the more certain she became that everyone was standing inside the wrong frame of reference. Not because they lacked intelligence, because they shared the same assumption. Her heartbeat quickened. She looked down at the notebook she carried in her apron pocket, then back at the screen, then back at the notebook. For the first time all day, she considered writing down what she was thinking. and that decision would lead her one step closer to a moment she never imagined possible. The notebook in Claire Bennett's apron pocket had been with her for years. Most people would have mistaken it for an ordinary collection of grocery lists, work schedules, and reminders. In reality, it held fragments of ideas, language notes, quotations from books, and observations gathered from moments most people forgot. That evening, standing near the back of the ballroom, she slowly pulled it from her pocket and opened it to a blank page. The conference continued around her. Experts debated. Cameras recorded. Guests listened. Claire lowered her eyes and began writing. She copied the phrase exactly as it appeared on the giant screen. Then she circled the word that had been bothering her all afternoon. For several seconds, she simply stared at it. The memory that had been surfacing throughout the day finally reached the surface. Years earlier, one of her professors had presented a case study involving language migration along ancient trade routes. Entire communities had lived between cultures for generations. Their speech borrowed elements from Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and local dialects. Outsiders often failed to recognize these linguistic mixtures because they insisted on placing every word inside a single category. Claire remembered the professor's warning. When everyone agrees on the wrong assumption, expertise can become a trap. The sentence echoed clearly in her mind. She looked back at the phrase. Suddenly the structure felt different. Not Arabic with unusual features. Something else entirely. Her pulse quickened. She began making notes beside individual words. Certain patterns appeared more obvious now. A prefix that seemed ordinary carried traces of another language family. A grammatical form that experts had treated as an error might actually be intentional. The pieces did not fit perfectly yet, but for the first time they appeared to belong to the same puzzle. Across the room, Nathan Sterling continued speaking with several scholars near the stage. The fatigue in his eyes was becoming harder to hide. 12 years. 12 years of searching for an answer connected to his late wife. 12 years of consultations, research, and dead ends. Claire watched him briefly. Then she looked towards Sophie, sitting quietly nearby. Unlike most teenagers, Sophie showed little interest in the attention surrounding the event. She seemed focused only on her father. Claire felt a small ache in her chest. Whatever the phrase meant, it clearly represented more than an intellectual challenge to their family. She returned her attention to the notebook. The ballroom lights reflected softly across the page. One note led to another. One memory unlocked another. Slowly, an idea began taking shape. Not a complete answer. Not yet. But a direction. A possibility strong enough to make her nervous. Almost immediately, doubt followed. She glanced around the room. 40 experts. Professors. Researchers. Authors. People who had spent entire careers studying these subjects. Who was she to think she had noticed something they missed? The thought made her close the notebook for a moment. Her face warmed with embarrassment. The idea felt impossible. Yet the more she tried to dismiss it, the stronger it became. She opened the notebook again, added another observation, then another. Across the ballroom, applause erupted as another expert finished speaking. Claire barely noticed. Her attention remained fixed on the page. For the first time all day, she was no longer wondering whether the experts were wrong. She was beginning to wonder whether she might actually know where the answer was hiding. The ballroom had grown quieter as the evening progressed. Earlier, every new speaker had generated excitement. Now the audience listened with a different kind of attention. Hope was fading. Not dramatically, gradually, like sunlight disappearing beyond the harbor outside the glass walls. Nathan Sterling stood near the stage reviewing notes from the latest presentation. The answer still felt out of reach. Around him, experts continued discussing possibilities in small groups. Some defended earlier conclusions. Others abandoned them completely. The phrase remained stubbornly unresolved. Across the room, Claire Bennett stood beside a service counter pretending to organize coffee supplies. In reality, she was staring at the notebook hidden beneath the counter. Several pages were now covered with observations. Arrows connected words. Margins contained references. From memory, questions filled the empty spaces. The more she studied the phrase, the more convinced she became that its structure crossed linguistic boundaries. It was not simply Arabic. It borrowed from somewhere else. Somewhere the experts had overlooked because they were searching for a single origin instead of a meeting point between cultures. Claire closed the notebook and took a slow breath. Her hands felt unsteady. She immediately placed the notebook back into her apron pocket. The idea seemed absurd. Even if her theory was correct, what would she do with it? Walk onto a stage filled with internationally recognized scholars and tell them they were wrong? The thought alone made her stomach tighten. She had spent years learning how not to attract attention. Working in hotels taught people many things. One lesson appeared repeatedly. Invisible people stayed safe. Invisible people avoided embarrassment. Invisible people were rarely challenged. Claire had become very good at being invisible. Near the front row, Sophie Sterling quietly stepped away from her seat and approached a refreshment table. Claire offered her a bottle of water with a polite smile. Sophie thanked her and glanced toward the stage. "My dad looks tired," she said softly. Claire followed her gaze. Nathan stood alone reviewing documents beneath the conference lights. For a moment, he seemed older than he had earlier that day. Not weak, simply tired. 12 years was a long time to carry an unanswered question. Claire nodded gently. "It looks important to him." Sophie smiled sadly. "It is." Before returning to her seat, Sophie added one more sentence. "He never gives up on things that matter." The words lingered long after she walked away. Claire looked down at the notebook in her pocket, then back toward the stage, then toward the phrase glowing on the giant screen. She suddenly remembered another moment from college. During a seminar discussion, a professor once asked why brilliant researchers sometimes miss obvious answers. The room had offered dozens of explanations. Finally, the professor smiled and said, "Because they stop looking where they least expect to find them." Claire felt her pulse quicken again. The phrase on the screen no longer looked confusing. It looked familiar, not fully solved, but familiar. The pieces were moving into place. One specific word had unlocked another. One pattern explained another. The connections were becoming harder to ignore. At that moment, Nathan returned to the microphone for the final session of the evening. The ballroom grew silent once more. "We have heard 40 interpretations today," he said, "and I am grateful for every one of them." He paused. His eyes moved across the audience. "But I still believe the correct answer exists." The room remained perfectly still. Claire lowered her hand into her apron pocket and touched the notebook. For the first time all day, she felt something stronger than doubt. She felt responsibility, and that frightened her far more than being wrong. Responsibility was heavier than confidence. Claire Bennett discovered that as she stood near the back wall of the ballroom with her notebook hidden inside her apron pocket, the answer forming in her mind no longer felt like a theory. It felt like a possibility. And possibilities carried consequences. Around her, the conference continued moving toward its conclusion. The audience remained attentive. The experts remained engaged. Yet an invisible fatigue had settled over the room. Hours of analysis had produced intelligence, effort, and debate. They had not produced certainty. Nathan Sterling stood beneath the conference lights and thanked the participants once again. His voice remained steady, but Claire could hear the disappointment beneath it. 12 years of searching had led to another day without a clear answer. The realization seemed to hang over the audience like a cloud. Claire looked toward the giant screen. The phrase glowed against the dark background exactly as it had that morning. Yet now she saw something completely different when she looked at it. She no longer saw a puzzle. She saw a trail leading toward an explanation hidden between cultures, histories, and languages. The notebook in her pocket contained enough observations to justify speaking. At least that was what logic suggested. Emotion suggested something entirely different. Emotion reminded her that 40 recognized experts had already stood before this audience. Emotion reminded her that she was carrying coffee trays, not academic credentials. Emotion reminded her how easy it would be to become a joke. Near the refreshment station, two guests discussed the challenge quietly. One laughed and said that perhaps nobody on Earth knew the answer. The other agreed. Claire lowered her eyes. If only they knew what was happening inside her mind. For several minutes, she tried convincing herself to let the matter go. The experts would continue researching. Nathan would continue searching. Someone else would eventually discover the truth. She could simply return to work tomorrow and forget the entire day. The argument sounded reasonable. It also felt dishonest. Across the ballroom, Sophie Sterling remained seated in the front row. Her attention never drifted far from her father. Claire remembered their brief conversation earlier. He never gives up on things that matter. The sentence returned unexpectedly. Nathan had spent 12 years pursuing an answer because the question mattered. What excuse did Claire have for remaining silent if she genuinely believed she could help? Her heartbeat quickened. She removed the notebook from her pocket and reviewed her notes one final time. The connections still held together. The linguistic crossover still made sense. The unusual structure still pointed toward the same conclusion. If she was wrong, she was wrong. But what if she was right? The thought refused to leave. On stage, Nathan prepared to close the evening session. Several audience members began collecting their belongings. Reporters packed equipment. Experts exchanged business cards. The event was ending. Claire felt a sudden wave of urgency. If she stayed silent now, the opportunity would disappear. Her fingers tightened around the notebook. Then she immediately loosened them again. Fear and responsibility battled each other in complete silence. One urged her forward. The other held her in place. Finally, she took a slow breath and looked toward the stage. Nathan was thanking everyone for attending. The moment was slipping away. Claire knew she had only seconds left to make a decision. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispered the same question she had been avoiding all evening. If the answer truly matters, why are you still afraid to say it out loud? The room was already beginning to move on when Claire Bennett finally took her first step. The sound was almost impossible to hear beneath the conversations spreading throughout the ballroom, yet to her it felt louder than anything she had experienced all day. One step, then another. Her notebook remained in her hand. Her heart beat so quickly she could feel it in her throat. Around her, guests collected jackets and briefcases. Reporters discussed their headlines. Experts exchanged final observations. Nobody noticed the waitress walking toward the stage. At least not at first. Nathan Sterling had nearly finished his closing remarks. He thanked the scholars once more for their effort and dedication. The audience responded with polite applause. Then, just as he prepared to leave the microphone, a hesitant voice reached the front of the room. "Excuse me." The applause faded. Nathan turned. Several nearby guests turned as well. Claire immediately wished she could disappear. Every instinct told her to walk away. But she remained standing. The notebook trembled slightly in her hand. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I know I should probably not interrupt." A few people exchanged puzzled looks. One reporter lowered his camera. Another raised it. Nathan studied her for a moment. Unlike many people in the room, he did not appear annoyed. He appeared curious. "Go ahead," he said calmly. The ballroom grew quieter. Claire swallowed. "I think everyone may be looking at the phrase the same way." Several experts immediately looked toward the giant screen. Others looked toward Claire. A few appeared skeptical. One scholar folded his arms. Claire noticed every reaction. The attention felt overwhelming. Yet once she began speaking, the words came more easily than she expected. The assumption has been that the phrase belongs entirely to one linguistic tradition. She glanced at the screen. "I do not think it does." Complete silence followed. Nathan stepped slightly closer. "What do you mean?" Claire opened her notebook. "I think part of the structure comes from Arabic influences. But I think another part comes from a historical language crossover that developed along older trade routes." Several experts exchanged surprised glances. One of them immediately shook his head. Another narrowed his eyes. Nathan said nothing. He simply listened. Claire continued. "Some of the words appear familiar because they were absorbed into multiple language communities over time. If you treat every word as belonging to the same origin, certain parts stop making sense." She pointed toward the screen. "That is why the third word keeps creating problems." A murmur spread across the audience. Nathan looked toward the phrase, then back toward Claire. Something in his expression changed. Not belief. Interest. Genuine interest. For the first time all day, someone had identified the exact point where every explanation had collapsed. Even the skeptical experts seemed unable to ignore that detail. Claire suddenly became aware that hundreds of people were staring at her. Heat rushed into her face. She almost apologized and stepped away. Then Nathan asked a question. "If that assumption is wrong," he said quietly, "what does the phrase actually mean?" The ballroom became so silent that even the distant hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. Claire looked down at her notes, then back at the screen. The answer was finally beginning to take shape. And in that moment, she realized there was no turning back. For several seconds, nobody moved. The question hung in the air between Claire Bennett and Nathan Sterling like a bridge that had not yet been crossed. Hundreds of eyes remained fixed on the young waitress standing near the front of the ballroom. The giant screen glowed behind her. The phrase that had resisted 40 experts now seemed to be waiting for her answer. Claire looked down at her notebook one final time. Then she slowly lifted her eyes. The fear remained. So did the doubt. Yet something stronger had finally taken its place. Clarity. I do not think the phrase is meant to be translated word for word, she said quietly. Several scholars immediately exchanged looks. Claire continued before her courage could disappear. I think it was written by someone who understood multiple language traditions and intentionally blended them together. Nathan listened without interruption. Sophie leaned forward in her seat. The audience remained completely silent. Claire stepped closer to the screen. Everyone has been treating the third word as though it belongs entirely to Arabic grammar. That is why every explanation breaks apart at the same point. She pointed toward the word. The structure only makes sense if it is being used as a borrowed expression rather than a native one. A low murmur spread through the room. One professor opened a notebook and began writing immediately. Another adjusted his glasses and stared at the screen. Claire turned another page in her notebook. The phrase is not describing an object, she continued. It is describing a promise. The room became even quieter. Nathan's expression changed slightly. Not because he understood her conclusion yet. Because for the first time all day, every piece of the explanation seemed connected to every other piece. Nothing felt forced. Nothing felt missing. Claire continued carefully. The wording suggests a message passed between cultures. The author was not trying to create a perfect sentence. The author was trying to preserve meaning. Several experts now looked less skeptical than fascinated. One of them stood from his seat and moved closer to the screen. Another began reviewing earlier notes. Claire pointed to a second section of the phrase. This part has been translated as a location all day. I do not think it refers to a place. She took a breath. I think it refers to a person. The audience gasped softly. Nathan stared at the screen. 12 years of assumptions suddenly shifted beneath his feet. Claire's voice remained steady. When the phrase is interpreted through the language crossover pattern, the entire meaning changes. Nathan finally spoke. Changes to what? Claire looked at the phrase one last time. Then she gave the interpretation she had spent hours assembling. The words were simple. Unexpectedly simple. Yet as she explained the meaning hidden beneath the blended language structures, the ballroom grew absolutely still. No whispers. No movement. No applause. Just silence. The kind of silence that appears when people realize they are hearing something important. Sophie slowly lowered her eyes. Nathan did not move at all. Across the room, several scholars began checking reference materials simultaneously. Others compared notes with growing urgency. Claire suddenly became aware that nobody was challenging her explanation. Nobody was dismissing it. In fact, the more the experts examined her reasoning, the less they seemed interested in defending their own. Nathan looked from the screen to Claire, then back to the screen again. For the first time that entire day, hope appeared in his eyes. And while the audience still did not know whether Claire was correct, everyone in the room sensed the same thing. The answer was closer than it had ever been before. The silence lasted longer than anyone expected. Claire Bennett lowered her notebook and waited. Part of her still expected someone to immediately explain why she was wrong. After all, she was standing in a ballroom filled with scholars who had spent entire careers studying languages she had not formally studied in years. Yet no objection came. Instead, something far more surprising happened. The experts began examining her explanation. One professor moved closer to the screen. Another reopened reference materials he had already packed away. Several researchers gathered around a table and started comparing notes. The atmosphere inside the ballroom changed completely. The event was no longer ending. It was beginning again. Nathan Sterling remained standing near the stage. Hope had appeared in his expression earlier. Now something else joined it. Caution. He had experienced too many false leads over the years to celebrate too soon. 12 years had taught him patience. Yet even he could see that Claire's interpretation had accomplished something none of the previous 40 explanations had managed to do. It connected every disputed section of the phrase into a single framework. Nothing was left isolated. Nothing was ignored. Across the room, journalists quickly returned to their equipment. Cameras that had already been turned off came back to life. Guests who had been preparing to leave sat down again. Conversations disappeared beneath a growing sense of anticipation. Claire stood quietly near the screen, wishing she could become invisible again. The attention felt overwhelming. Nathan noticed her discomfort immediately. Take your time, he said gently. His voice carried through the room. Nobody is rushing you. Claire nodded. She appreciated the kindness more than he realized. A few minutes later, one of the senior scholars approached the microphone. The room fell silent again. He adjusted his glasses and looked first at the screen, then at Claire. I have reviewed her observations regarding the third word. He paused. The linguistic crossover theory is valid. A murmur swept across the ballroom. Several audience members exchanged stunned looks. The scholar continued. In fact, it explains inconsistencies that many of us were unable to resolve throughout the day. More murmurs followed. Another expert stood, then another. One by one, respected academics began acknowledging the same conclusion. They did not all agree on every detail. Yet they agreed on something important. Claire had identified the correct direction. Nathan listened carefully. Sophie stared at the stage with wide eyes. Claire felt as though she had stepped into someone else's life. The room that barely noticed her hours earlier was now discussing her ideas. The realization felt almost unreal. Nathan finally turned toward Claire. Can I ask you something? She nodded. Where did you learn this? The question made her smile softly. Not because the answer was impressive, because it was ordinary. College, she said. A long time ago. Nathan waited. Claire looked down briefly. I never finished. The room became quiet again. Not the silence of mystery. The silence of surprise. Nathan studied her for a moment. A waitress. A notebook. An unfinished education. Yet somehow she had succeeded where 40 experts could not. Across the ballroom, several people seemed to be realizing the same thing at the same time. Expertise mattered. Credentials mattered. Experience mattered. But sometimes the difference between finding an answer and missing it entirely was simply the willingness to look at a problem from a different angle. Nathan looked back toward the phrase on the screen, then toward Claire again. And for the first time in 12 years, he began to believe he might finally be standing at the edge of the truth. The ballroom no longer felt like a conference hall. It felt like a place where something long forgotten was finally being uncovered. Scholars gathered around tables covered with notes and reference books. Reporters waited quietly. Guests who had planned to leave remained in their seats. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Claire Bennett stood near the stage holding her notebook against her apron. The attention still felt unfamiliar. Only a few hours earlier, she had been carrying coffee cups between tables without attracting a second glance. Now some of the most respected experts in the room were reviewing her reasoning. Nathan Sterling remained remarkably calm on the outside. Inside, however, something was changing. For 12 years, every promising lead eventually collapsed. Every theory contained flaws. Every explanation left important questions unanswered. Tonight felt different. Not because he desperately wanted it to be true. Because for the first time, the evidence seemed to move in a single direction. One of the senior linguists approached Nathan carrying several pages of notes. The two men spoke quietly for a few moments. Then Nathan looked toward Claire. His expression held neither skepticism nor surprise. It held respect. Genuine respect. The scholar returned to the microphone. We have reviewed the structural framework she proposed, he announced. Several independent references support the possibility that the phrase originated within a multilingual cultural environment. A wave of discussion spread through the audience. The scholar continued. More importantly, her interpretation resolves inconsistencies that none of our previous models could adequately explain. Claire lowered her eyes. She never imagined hearing words like that directed toward her. Nathan stepped closer. You said earlier that the phrase was preserving meaning rather than language. Claire nodded. Yes. Why? Claire looked toward the screen. The answer came naturally now. Because people preserve language when they are writing for scholars. They preserve meaning when they are writing for someone they love. Silence filled the room. Sophie slowly looked up from her seat. Nathan did not move. Claire immediately worried she had spoken too personally. Yet something in Nathan's face suggested otherwise. He seemed less interested in the technical explanation than in what the explanation revealed about the person who wrote it. Claire continued carefully. The phrase feels intentional, not academic. It reads like someone trying to make sure a message survives even if language changes over time. Nathan stared at the words on the screen. Suddenly, he remembered something. Years ago, his wife had often spoken about language as a bridge between people rather than a system of rules. She loved history. She loved cultural stories. She believed meaning mattered more than perfection. The memory arrived unexpectedly. For a moment, Nathan forgot about the audience entirely. Sophie noticed the change immediately. She had not seen that expression on her father's face in years. Across the room, experts continued reviewing source materials. One by one, more confirmations emerged. The linguistic patterns Claire identified were real. The crossover structures existed. The historical context supported her theory. The room was no longer asking whether her approach was valid. The room was asking how nobody had noticed it sooner. Nathan finally turned toward Claire. "Why did you stop studying?" The question surprised her. She hesitated, then answered honestly. "Life happened." Nathan nodded slowly. No further explanation was needed. Some stories required only 3 words. Around them, conversations continued, growing more excited. The truth felt close enough to touch. Yet the most important discovery of the evening was no longer the phrase itself. It was the realization that wisdom had entered the room wearing an apron. And before the night ended, Nathan would learn that the answer he had searched for 12 years had been waiting in the least expected place. The answer arrived quietly, not with applause, not with celebration. It arrived the way many important truths arrive, piece by piece, evidence by evidence, confirmation by confirmation. Nearly an hour had passed since Claire Bennett first stepped forward. The ballroom remained full. Nobody wanted to leave now. Scholars continued reviewing sources. Journalists continued recording. Guests who had expected to witness an academic challenge found themselves watching something far more human. Nathan Sterling stood beside the stage while several experts completed their final evaluations. The atmosphere felt different from anything he had experienced during the previous 12 years. For the first time, every new piece of information strengthened the same conclusion rather than weakening it. Claire's framework continued holding together. More importantly, it explained details that had remained unresolved for more than a decade. One of the senior researchers approached the microphone. The room immediately became silent. He looked toward Nathan before speaking. "After reviewing the available references, our team believes the linguistic interpretation presented this evening is substantially correct." A wave of astonishment spread across the ballroom. Several audience members looked toward Claire. Others looked toward Nathan. A few simply sat in silence, processing what they had heard. The researcher continued. "The phrase appears to preserve a personal message using blended language structures that would have been recognizable to a very specific cultural environment." Nathan closed his eyes briefly, not because the mystery was completely solved, because for the first time, it finally made sense. Claire's explanation had transformed a puzzle into a message, and messages were something human beings could understand. Sophie slowly walked toward her father. Nathan placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Neither spoke. They did not need to. Across the room, Claire stood quietly near the screen. She felt strangely disconnected from the attention surrounding her. The answer no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the family that had spent 12 years searching for it. Nathan eventually turned toward the audience. His voice remained calm, but emotion softened every word. "For 12 years, I believed I was searching for a translation." He glanced toward the phrase. "Tonight, I learned I was actually searching for understanding." The room listened carefully. Nathan looked toward Claire. "Every expert who came here today helped move us closer to the truth. But one person saw something the rest of us missed." Claire immediately looked down. The attention still embarrassed her. Nathan smiled slightly. She stopped asking what language the message belonged to and started asking who the message was written for. The audience remained silent. It was the kind of silence that appears when people recognize wisdom. Nathan turned back toward the screen. The phrase no longer felt mysterious. Through Claire's interpretation, it revealed itself as something simple and deeply personal. A message of trust. A message intended to survive time. A message written by someone who cared more about meaning than perfection. Sophie quietly wiped away a tear. Nathan noticed and squeezed her shoulder gently. Around them, even the scholars seemed moved by what the evening had become. The challenge had begun as a search for expertise. It had become a reminder about humanity. Claire looked toward the harbor beyond the glass walls. Night had fully arrived. Reflections shimmered across the water. The day that began with 40 experts competing for an answer was ending with a waitress helping people understand a memory. Yet one important question still remained unanswered. Nathan knew it. Sophie knew it. Even Claire sensed it. The mystery had finally been solved. Now everyone wanted to know what would happen next. 1 year later, The harbor looked almost the same. The water still reflected the morning sunlight. The city still moved with the same steady rhythm. Yet for Claire Bennett, everything had changed. She stood near a large window inside the Center for Cultural Language Research, a nonprofit institute that had opened only 6 months earlier. Students moved through the hallways carrying notebooks. Researchers discussed projects in nearby offices. On a wall near the entrance hung a simple plaque. It did not mention awards. It did not mention money. It simply stated that the institute existed to support talented people whose education had been interrupted by life circumstances. Claire had argued for that wording herself. Across town, Nathan Sterling sat in the audience of a small ceremony with Sophie beside him. Neither occupied the front row. Neither requested special attention. They were there for one reason. They wanted to watch the next generation begin opportunities that once seemed impossible. A year earlier, Nathan had offered Claire a position helping develop language preservation initiatives connected to his foundation. She accepted only after insisting that the work focus on education rather than recognition. The decision changed more than her future. It changed hundreds of others. Scholarships had been created. Research programs had been funded. Students who once believed their dreams had ended found new paths forward. As the ceremony continued, several speakers shared stories about perseverance, curiosity, and second chances. Claire listened quietly. She never became comfortable being the center of attention. Some things never changed. During a break, Sophie approached her with a smile. Now 15 years old, she carried herself with the same quiet strength her father admired. "You know," Sophie said, "people still talk about that night." Claire laughed softly. "I hope not too much." Sophie smiled. Not because of the answer. Claire looked curious. Sophie pointed toward a group of students across the room. Because of what it reminded people. Claire followed her gaze. Young researchers discussed ideas excitedly around a table covered with books and notes. None of them cared who had discovered the answer that night. They cared about the lesson behind it. Nathan joined them a few moments later. Time had softened some of the sadness he carried for years. The mystery that once consumed him no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a gift. The answer had helped him understand something important about his late wife. But Claire had helped him understand something equally important about the living. He looked around the room and smiled. "The Institute is doing better than I imagined." Claire shook her head gently. "People are doing better than we imagined." Nathan nodded. She was right. As the ceremony ended, sunlight filled the room. Conversations continued. New friendships formed. New opportunities began. Nobody mentioned billionaires. Nobody mentioned experts. Nobody mentioned the challenge that started everything. They did not need to. The lesson remained long after the event itself became a memory. Sometimes the person with the answer is not the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes they are the one quietly carrying a notebook, waiting for someone to notice. And sometimes the greatest mistake is assuming that ordinary people are ordinary at all.